As a clinical psychologist, I would like to briefly highlight why considering gender is essential in mental health research. Of course, to this audience, I don't need to remind the definition of diversity. I just would like to highlight how many differences are included in it. Also from how many domains like gender, age, political beliefs. So omitting them can lead to so many biases, both in research and clinical practice. As a clinical psychologist, I'll focus on the role of diversity from the health perspective. It is very important, of course, for patients. It means, for example, adapting communication to language, culture, age, or cognitive abilities, IQ, of our patients. And recently in Poland, but also all over the world, we are more focused on this in healthcare. We have new recommendations, even new protocols are created. From psychological perspective, these factors matter at almost every level: diagnosis, therapy, and research. We are aware of diversity, of course, in theory, but not always in practice. Some differences as gender are still often overlooked, and the consequences can be serious and even harmful. We can see this in medicine, pharmacology, and also in psychology. For example, connected with gender norms influences behavior, reporting, and diagnosis. But when we are thinking about omitting gender, we may not talk only about women. It is clearly seen in epidemiological data that some disorders and diseases are more common in women, other in men. However, sometimes we are not aware that this data comes from clinical samples, means people who have already been diagnosed. It is not widely known that we do not conduct true populational screening. It is just too expensive. We don't do it in Poland, we don't do it in Europe. We generally do not do it. So this data, which we know about epidemiology, are very clinical and general. So telling the truth, we don't know how many people remain undiagnosed or how many symptoms are overlooked. Of course, mental disorders are not a single category, but a large variety group of conditions. Their number is really substantial. Here we can see the print screen from the newest ICD classification. And this classification of World Health Organization presents the extensive catalog of mental and behavioral disorder. Let us briefly recall the differences between mental and neurodevelopmental disorders. We will need it later. Mental disorders involve problems with thinking, emotions, or behavior. And what is important, they can appear at any stage of life. They don't have to appear in childhood. In contrast, neurodevelopmental disorders begin always in early developmental period, usually in early childhood, and are linked to how the brain develops. They tend to last longer and affect areas like learning, communication, and self-control. In ICD-11, this newest classification, around 20 categories of mental disorders are listed. Of course, in practice, a smaller number is usually highlighted. Most often, 7-8 main groups are discussed, like depression and other mood disorders, anxiety disorder, stress disorder, eating disorder, psychotic one, including schizophrenia, addictions, and also personality disorder. When we looked at prevalence rates by gender, clear difference can be observed. Mental disorders are more commonly diagnosed in women. In contrast, men and boys are more often diagnosed with behavioral disorders, such as addiction and neurodevelopmental disorders. Among neurodevelopmental disorders, the most common include autism, ADHD, and specific learning disorders like dyslexia, for example. It's clearly visible that apart from intellectual disability, these disorders are much more common in boys. However, again, an important question arrives. Do they actually occur more often, or are they simply diagnosed more frequently? Do we really observe sex differences in prevalence of mental and neurodevelopmental disorders? Is it fact or just diagnostic artifact? At this point, I would like to refer to my own research experience connected with comorbidity of dyslexia and ADHD. To this project, I invited 240 kids, same age, same IQ, divided into groups, boys and girls, and then divided in 4 clinical subgroups. Kids with ADHD, dyslexia, comorbidity of dyslexia and ADHD, and of course, control group. Controlling gender was very important for me because I realized that the research including girls with ADHD or comorbidity of ADHD and dyslexia are really rare. So it took me over 4 years to find all of them. Boys, it was very easy, but for girls, it was difficult. So I was really expecting some interesting data. We made a lot of very interesting psychological and neuropsychological research. Results are really well published, but I was also interested in gender differences, and I was expecting a lot. And I found nothing. No gender differentiation in memory functioning. Why? So instead of getting answer, I got more questions. Did the recruitment procedure was incorrect? Did we miss something? Because we were including only girls and boys with diagnosis. We were not diagnosing. It was not a population study. We were inviting kids with diagnosis of ADHD, dyslexia, or comorbidity. So instead of answers, we got more questions. And let's follow up some of these questions. We must realize that research and clinical practice in neurodevelopmental disorders are mostly based on male samples. As a result, symptoms in females are often overlooked and misdiagnosed. Current diagnostic criteria like ICD-ISO or DSM-5 are not gender specific. So girls are often missed in diagnosis. Of course, the differences are not only because of misdiagnosis, but also because of biological mechanism and etiology of neurodevelopmental disorders. Neurodevelopmental disorders means that child's brain develops in specific, different, and constitutionally determined way. What does the constitutionally actually means? It is more than just biology. It shows how the body and nervous system develops over time. I think that the good example might be here fetal alcohol syndrome, where alcohol consumption during pregnancy, of course this environmental factor, affects brain development. So because of environmental factors, the whole way the brain develops, the nervous system develops is changed. But when can we say that development is no longer typical and that behavior becomes a symptom? According to the definition, behavior becomes a symptom when due its frequency or intensity, it significantly impairs or prevents and individuals' ability to function effectively. Let's imagine that I start sneezing now. If I sneeze once, this is just a behavior. Happened. But if I start sneezing each 2-3 minutes, or if I will sneeze really heavily during the period of 10 minutes, just single behavior can be seen as a symptom of maybe allergy or maybe flu. So we must remember that recognizing behavior as a symptom is not a clear cut. It has no strict boundaries, and it is always in some way subjective. So this is subjective decision if we find the behavior already symptomatic. And there is, of course, the question, if we do not see the behavior as symptomatic too quickly, if we do not diagnose disorders too quickly. And this is where the concept, very popular now, concept of neurodiversity comes in. This concept suggests that differences in development are not necessarily disorders. A neurodiversity concept suggests that we should treat neurocognitive functioning as a continuum rather than dividing into healthy, unhealthy, correct, or mistaken functioning. So we can create kind of neurodiversity umbrella, which includes almost all or even more neurodevelopmental disorders. Of course, this is new theory, and each new theory has supporters and opponents. I represent the group that believes that there is a pool of normative behavior. According to developmental psychology, these typical milestones in development, like child is supposed to sit, walk, talk, control their behavior. So these are these normative behaviors. But sometimes, even if the behavior do not occur so often, all behaviors are not common, it doesn't mean that they are incorrect. So here, now at this picture, we can see this neurodiversity concept. Normative behavior and this untypical. So neurodiverse. But I'm clinical psychologist, and clinical psychologists and psychiatrists postulate to give another part. We think that there is a line, and crossing this line is already crossing this typical and untypical development, that there is a line, and after this line, there are disorders. So we have normative behavior, neurodiversity, so untypical, not so popular behavior, but also neurodevelopmental disorders. Of course, thanks to this concept, also clinicians, psychiatrists postulate that the list of symptoms very typical for disorder, not only for untypical behavior, should be much longer. And there should be involved also specific issues for for gender, age, and also for culture. Of course, as we can see, these two approaches really differ. The psychiatric clinical approach is focused on neurodevelopmental disorders. So we are searching for symptoms or pathological behavior, so it may lead to overdiagnosis. While the neurodiversity approach may result, of course, in underdiagnosis, because almost each behavior can be seen not as a pathological, but as a untypical, not so popular. And overdiagnosis is a really major issue, especially among children. And unluckily, autism spectrum disorder is one of them. And autism is diagnosed worldwide, but its prevalence varies across countries. It is included in all clinical psychiatric classifications, And diagnostic criteria are based on so-called autistic diet. It includes two groups of behaviors: persistent deficit in social communication and/or interaction, and the other one, repetitive patterns of behavior. Autism is one of the conditions that is not only diagnosed more frequently in boys, but historically it was even considered as rare or almost non-existing among girls. But in recent years, we can see kind of explosion of research searching for a female-specific presentation of autism. So now we do have two main concepts explaining why there is less girls with diagnosis of autistic spectrum disorder. The biological one is concentrated on genetic research, and it suggests that girls may need a higher genetic load to develop autism. So we can say that girls are in some way protected by genetic. On the other hand, another concept, this systemic bias, shows that still diagnostic criteria are connected with treating autism as a typical male disorder. So girls' behavior are just overlooked. And this girl behavior in autism are so specific that sometimes we are even talking about subculture within subculture, especially in case of really high functioning girls with previously called Asperger's syndrome. So they can be undiagnosed even till adulthood, or just never diagnosed. Sometimes they start to think, oh, maybe I had or have Asperger or syndrome or autism during diagnosis of their kids or grandkids. So researchers are trying to identify gender-related differences in how the same symptoms of disorder are expressed. Symptom is the same, but behavior is a little bit different. For example, this male typical presentation of autistic spectrum disorder are usually connected with these repetitive behaviors or physical stereotypes, so more motorical, clearly seen. And the female typical one usually can be connected with unspecific, strange interests, but also compulsions. So they are not so often generally connected with autism. But autism just illustrates the broader pattern across neurodevelopmental disorders. Girls are not only diagnosed later, but often receive several prior diagnoses along the way. Some of them are misdiagnosed. Some are just diagnoses of co-occurrence. Another example of disorder more frequently diagnosed in boys is ADHD. Sometimes it is even overdiagnosed. But girls are often missed in this diagnosis. Of course, the core symptoms of ADHD include inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. But additionally like procrastination, time blindness, but also emotional dysregulation can be really clearly seen not by agnostic, but by friends, parents, teacher of the person with ADHD. Similarly to autism, ADHD is often considered as a boy disorder. So research and diagnostic criteria have been largely based on male presentation. So girls are very often not diagnosed, but also there are so many myths surrounded ADHD in girls. For example, extensive talking, emotionally behaviors in girls usually can be directly reflected with ADHD impulsivity, but are called just, girlish behavior. Also, high academic achievement just may mask symptoms because many girls compensate their problems. Among girls, ADHD is often also misinterpreted just as a behavior issue, while it's actually a neurobiological condition affecting attention and especially executive functions. This polarization largely reflects differences in symptom presentation and often is described in psychopathology as externalizing and internalizing patterns. Externalizing are much more typical, of course, for boys, internalizing for girls. Externalizing and internalizing behaviors differ mainly in their visibility to others. Internalizing behaviors are inward directed, so quiet, hidden, less likely to be noticed, so often underdiagnosed. Externalizing behaviors are outward directed, so visible, loud, often disruptive. They disrupt teachers, parents, friends, so they are often overdiagnosed. The higher visibility of externalizing behaviors is one of the reasons why boys are diagnosed earlier, especially in a large primary school classroom. Quiet, inattentive girls are often simply overlooked. As mentioned before, girls are not only diagnosed later, but are also more likely to receive indirect or misdirect diagnoses that focus on more female symptoms, like anxiety or depression. When we look at these differences, they can be explained also by the concept from a social psychology. For example, according to objectivization theory, women tend to constantly monitor themselves, how they behave, how they come across, but it takes up mental energy. The social role theory suggests that women are often expected to hold social life together, to manage relationship. So when they struggle, it's even more noticeable and it is unliked and more likely to be judged. And finally, the idea of double burden. Neurodivergent women are dealing not only with executive dysfunction, but also with a higher expectation, which makes everything even more challenging. Neurodevelopmental disorders were more often diagnosed among boys and men, but mental disorders are more commonly diagnosed in women. We will take depressive disorder as an example. According to World Health Organization, depression is one of the most common mental disorders, but still underdiagnosed. And what is very interesting, the risk of developing depression appears to be increasing across generations. So now the younger generation has higher rate of depression than our generation. Of course, beyond the core symptoms like depressed mood, loss of interest, reduced energy, and these symptoms are required for diagnosis depression, there are many additional ones. They may vary in intensity, they are not always present, but they can be also very distressing. And again, we come to internalizing and externalizing symptoms. Now we can clearly see how strongly they are gendered and how they can distort the clinical picture. Aggressive and externalizing behaviors, typical for men, are usually not associated with depression. We don't see them as depression symptom. So when man behaves like this, we don't look at him from the perspective of depression. As a result, they may not be seen and they may not receive appropriate help. That's why here is the very sad but also strong title of manual. Chłopaki nie płaczą, chłopaki z okien skaczą. Boys don't cry, they leap from high. Now I will use depression as an example to show how gender differences affect how mental disorders show up in practice. So gender differences arise from combination of biological, psychological, and cultural factors. The biological reasons are largely driven by hormones and their effects on the brain. Of course, it includes sex hormones like progesterone, estrogen, and testosterone, but also neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine, and especially serotonin is directly connected with mood disorders, especially depression, but not only. Psychological factors also play a role here, especially differences with coping styles. Women are more likely to ruminate, when men tend to externalize stress. So again, we see the internalizing versus externalizing patterns. But in this situation, especially cultural factors are really crucial. From early age, we are taught different roles. Women to be caring and emotional, men to be strong and stoic. These expectations shape how distress is expressed, if and how and when people seek help, and also how their struggles are perceived by society. From this perspective, upbringing really matters, and the contrast is clear. Girls are taught to feel and relate, boys to act and suppress. And both patterns come with their own risk of mental health. These non-biological differences in mental health between women and men are often explained by referring to traditional masculinity ideologies. These concepts define how men are expected to behave: strong, emotionally controlled. This norm, generally accepted norms, really leave little room for mental health difficulties, especially those that are internalizing, means quiet, vulnerable, less visible. As a result, men are often diagnosed later. They even don't admit they are struggling, and too often they only get help when things are already on the breaking point. As a result, many men develop additional disorders as a way of coping, most often connected with substance use. You can see that the gender difference is really high here. In women, of course, they also have this problem with substance use, but this pattern is less common, and more often it reflects coping with daily stress rather than co-occurring mental health conditions. It's important to highlight that alcohol is a special case because its occasional use is socially accepted and often even part of everyday social life. Of course, there are visible biological differences. Men and women process alcohol differently, which affects both how they drink and how possible addiction develops. The gender gap in substance use disorder, the substance use disorder is traditionally higher in men, shapes both biological and social factors. For example, women metabolize alcohol more slowly, so they are drunk longer. Women tend to react more emotionally to alcohol, while men, alcohol use is more strongly linked to reward system. Women more often drink in response to stress, while men tend to drink more impulsively. So their reason of drinking, way of drinking, and way of getting drunk is different also from biological perspective. Women and men differ not only in the way they drink, but also in the types of disorders that tend to occur with addiction. Because female substance use profile is very often connected with previous trauma, so this is a way of dealing with it. Comorbid disorders might be from the group of anxiety disorder, depression, or PTSD. Among male, drinking is much more connected with social pressure, social environment. So the mental comorbidities might be rather related to antisocial personality disorder or other aggressive behavioral. Also, seeking for help is really different. Women which struggle with substance use seek help earlier and more often, but very often they meet the wall. Why? Because their drinking is often hidden and internalized. They drink in secret and feel strong shame and stigma. There is less social acceptance for drinking among women, and also they fear being judged and seen as bad mothers. On the other hand, men seek help later and less frequently because society is more tolerant to their drinking. However, when men enter treatment, they benefit more. Traditional programs are better suited to male recovery patterns. The final group of disorders I would like to discuss is eating disorder, especially in connection with body image disturbance. Eating disorders occur worldwide, and in their most severe form, anorexia, they affect over 1% of the population, primarily young women. In the context of eating-related problems, we sometimes refer to so-called scissor effect, because on the one side, we can see increasing rates of anorexia, really severe one, and we must remember that till 30% of mostly girls with anorexia will not fight with this disorder. They will die. On the other hand, we can observe the obesity epidemic, especially in developed countries. So from the one side, we have really underweight individuals, on the other side, obese one. Gender differences are particularly visible in weight-related eating disorders, like anorexia and bulimia. We can clearly see that they are much more typical for girls. Because, for example, when we look at the binge eating, the gender equality is really 50-50. Also, statistics connected with overweight and obesity are quite equal. But this weight-related eating disorder, means anorexia especially, are closely linked to gender-specific attitudes to body image. And boys and girls are socialized differently in how they relate to their bodies from the very early stage. We can see that in the early stages, parents primarily focus on the child's physical health. Feeding practices are even considered as the earliest form of parenting style. Of course, these practices reflect how parents themselves understand and approach health. So it is connected with their eating habits, with their BMI, and taking part in physical activity. As the child grows, These attitudes also become tied to perception of physical attractiveness. And this is where the child's gender begins to play roles. Parents seem to treat different boys and girls. This, together with the beauty standard and stereotypes which parents believe in, it creates the child perspective on their own bodies. These stereotypical messages from parents and also wider environment affect children from the very early stage. Girls are guided toward appearance, so you can clearly see that, for example, toys are very beautiful and girls would like to look like their toys. The same is in story tales and cartoons they watch, while boys are expected to focus on agency and competence. Researchers conducted among very young kids, 3 years old, clearly showed that if they were looking at the silhouettes of other kids, really skinny, with medium weight and obese, they found the fat one ugly, almost all of them. But only 50% of them found the really skinny one also as example of ugliness. In my own research, because body image connected with eating disorder, this is another area of my research experience, we also have observed strong stereotypes of beauty and social success already in young children 5 to 8. So these children, there were more than 800 children, explicitly described people with overweight as ugly, not with obesity. You can see the silhouettes, yes? They were overweight, not obese. But they also linked body weight to happiness as well as financial and social success. But it was typical, especially when we were asking about women. Not we are asking both boys and girls, but about women. But one interesting thing, you can see the question, which man, woman is the nicest. Only in this question, we do not see really big difference between underweight, normal classic weight, normative weight, and overweight people. But in adults, body weight is still a central factor in how attractiveness is perceived, especially for women. It explains more than 50% of variances of attractiveness. In men, apart from clear obesity, this is not so important. But it is not only about which aspect of appearance matters, but also how the body is treated, how it is seen. It is seen as an object or as a process. If you see your body as a process, it means that you concentrate at how the body works. Is it healthy? Can you use this body? If it works, if you can walk, talk, run, if you want, you can be generally satisfied. And this way of perception body is typical for men. But when body is seen as a collection of separate parts, there is always something to be unhappy with. It helps to explain so-called normative dissatisfaction observed in women, especially among adolescents. More than 50% of girls are not satisfied, even dissatisfied, because of their appearance. And when you look at this, together with media beauty standards, you can really understand how eating disorders, especially among women, develops. Because these weight-related disorders, as we could see, are really typical for girls. Of course, body image disturbance also affect men, not only women. In particular, muscle dysmorphia. It is called bigorexia. It is often described as typically male disorder and even often compared, of course, in its clinical presentation, yes, to anorexia, because also the most important is the changed, very subjective perception of your body. Last but not least, transgender individuals represent a group with a particularly high vulnerability and significant gaps in diagnosis and care. They are still very rarely included in research. Even this presentation has not captured their perspective. To sum up, there are clear sex-gender differences in mental health, partially rooted in biology. However, gender bias arises when these biological differences are overemphasized in research and diagnosis. Social rules and expectations change the clinical picture and often lead to misdiagnosis. So biology from the one side, but gender-specific picture, gender-specific way of showing symptoms should be really considered during diagnosis and treatment. Thank you for your attention, but also for your patience. It was just a small part of this topic, which is very interesting for me, but also from practical point of view, this topic should be more and more important from practitioners.